Okay, we will start this United Kingdom session by acknowledging that, as of this recording anyway, Ed Balls Day for 2019 is in fact 1 week away, so we hope everyone is either preparing for the festivities or you have done so and celebrated accordingly. So we will look forward to that or look back on it and look forward to the 2020 celebration, of course. And off we go to the UK here. Let's remember that it is a multinational state with 4 constituent nations. We have England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as the 4. It's a unitary state along with that principle of devolution, so they have had a decentralization of power since the late 1990s under Blair, when Scotland and Wales were given the option to have a regional parliament, each via referendum. The public voted yes in both cases, and then the Northern Ireland parliament was also reconstituted as part of the Good Friday Agreement. So that has been it. Now, while you're studying how to really focus 1979 and onward, in the era of Thatcher and onward, the overall political development of the UK is important, and there are several things to keep in mind. There is no formal written constitution. It's not true to say that the UK does not have a constitution. It's a jumble of parliamentary acts and laws and so forth, but there is no one formal document, and the phrase is typically the Constitution is what happens. It has given them great flexibility over the course of time, allowed them to be pragmatic in the face of change. Along with that, the notion of gradualism has allowed the UK to move from state building concern to state building concern without that revolutionary instigation that we've seen in the other countries. It has been evolutionary rather than revolutionary, and that gradualism over the course of hundreds of years has allowed the UK's political development to be relatively peaceful. Also, it has been insular rather than isolationist. They've been able to develop on their own without outside political pressures being placed upon them, rather than having tumult from the European continent come into play. But Britain has certainly not been isolationist, as they have been colonizers and imperializers all over the world. That geographic separation from the continent has also lent Britain a sense of security. It has very much also, though, played into identity concerns, and it's also at the heart of what the Brexit debate is all about today. Post-1945 is centered on the collectivist consensus. That was, in fact, the era in when a devastated Britain after World War II. You had both major parties, the Labour Party and the Tories, agreeing that there ought to be a bipartisan implementation of the modern welfare state. NHS as its centerpiece, of course, under the leadership of Labour, and that was kind of that golden era of British political culture. It was the era in which they were said to have a civic culture, lots of efficacy, lots of trust in the system. And that spirit really continued into the 60s and into the early 70s before the conflicts that were to come reared their heads. The disruption of the collectivist consensus certainly has a lot of elements to it. Economics was one. Lots of unemployment. The economy slowed down. The Brits really struggled to adapt to that post-World War II services and technology economy. So you had unions becoming very powerful in concert with the Labour Party. Lots of strikes, lots of economic issues, and the public perceiving the unions to be out of control as part of that loony left. The unions very militant, and so on. And you also had the Troubles erupt in Northern Ireland in the late 1960s into the 70s and beyond, of course. This, remember, was that cleavage between Catholics and Protestants, where you had this era known as the Troubles in groups like the Ulster Defence Association, the Irish Republican Army, engaging in what certainly amounts to terrorist acts against one another. Over 4,000 people killed during the 3 decades leading up to the Good Friday Agreement, and this was something that affected not just Northern Ireland, but the violence affected the broader United Kingdom, including London itself. So the 70s were a tough time in the UK. Labour, remember that arm thing I did from class? Okay, here we go. Picture me. with my Michael Phelps torso and Michael Phelps arms. So Labor went out to the very far left with beliefs such as unilateral nuclear disarmament, the major play on a bigger welfare state, and so forth. And then Margaret Thatcher came along and took the Tories to the far right. So in the late 70s and the 1980s, the parties became ideologically polarized. There is the Iron Lady. Let's do recall some of the key items about Margaret Thatcher. She was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1979 until 1990, first female Prime Minister in UK history. She won 3 national elections when she was head of the Tories, 1979, 83, and 87. And she was, in fact, finally ousted in a leadership challenge by John Major in 1990. The Thatcher era has to be defined by that N-word, by neoliberalism, and remember that that is characterized by privatization of industry, the reduction in taxes, reduction in social welfare spending, promotion of free trade. Those free market principles catapulted Thatcher to 3 electoral victories. It earned her the love of some, the hatred of others. Remember the Ding Dong the Witch is Dead reference in class after her death in 2013. And she was hated by some and loved by some, and there was very little middle ground with Margaret Thatcher. She was a Eurosceptic. She was a major anti-communist, and her era was marked by increased national economy, but also increasing social class cleavages. She was ousted in 1990 by John Major when the moderates and the Tories revolted against Thatcher's increased neoliberal outlook, the poll tax, the inclusion of too many from the far right in her cabinet. And you had a leadership challenge to Thatcher. She resigned in 1990. John Major took over, Major bringing the Tories back to the center right, less Eurosceptic, less neoliberal. And Major was the one who, in fact, signed the Maastricht Treaty, getting the formally connecting the United Kingdom to the European Union. Major served until 97, and then he was utterly destroyed along with the Tories in the 1997 general election by New Labour under Tony Blair. Blair, remember, took Labour from the far left and made them a center-left moderate catch-all party. And Blair was the guy who said we need to accept some of Thatcherism's good traits. We can combine that with old Labour's socialist tendencies to moderate the fallout from neoliberalism. And so that was going to be the third way, the best of Thatcherism and the best of socialism. And Blair put into place this third way philosophy in governing. So he did accept much of Thatcher's neoliberal reforms. He put into place the New Deal, that welfare to work policy. He repealed Clause 4 from the Labour Constitution, which meant that Labour was now formally saying that yes, they would allow for the acceptance of the free market. After the 7/7 attacks, he certainly became center-right on security and immigration, while maintaining that center-left stance economically and socially. Of course, the Iraq War is going to play a big role in all of this. And Labour under Blair was historically effective from an electoral standpoint. They won 3 national elections, including some heavy majorities, especially in the first couple. And the public lost its faith in Blair, certainly after the Iraq War. And so when you compare these two, you have a conservative Thatcher versus a New Labour Blair, a neoliberal versus a moderate leftist. Thatcher got rid of the collectivist consensus almost entirely, and Blair shared much of her economic ideology, but maintained that commitment to greater social equality that old Labour was still trying to advocate for. Blair's big policy issues definitely, you have to start with Iraq. He was never forgiven by the British public for taking the United Kingdom to war along with George W. Bush. The Northern Ireland piece is a big part of his legacy. Remember, he did sign and engineer the Good Friday Agreement between the Catholics and Protestants that provided for a power-sharing deal between the two sides and the reconstitution of the Northern Ireland Parliament. Devolution in 97-98, along with the allocation of regional parliaments to Scotland and Wales. He said, we will be the party of law and order. He said, we'll go after antisocial behavior. He was a stronger leader of European integration than had taken place under Thatcher for sure. The whole time it was third-way politics. Blair was criticized for being too flashy and too focused on spin rather than substance. And of course, he had to deal with the ramifications of the 7/7 attacks that took place when Al-Qaeda attacked London with 4 bombs as a response to British involvement in the Iraq War. Blair's big constitutional reforms that we should be aware of: he did devolve power, as I've mentioned. He signed into play in 1998 the Human Rights Act, which included the inclusion in British law of the European Convention on Human Rights, which gave British citizens the essentially the human civil rights that they had not had on paper before. The House of Lords Reform Act of 1999 limited the number of hereditary peers to 92. The 2005 Act, which created the Supreme Court, was an innovation for Blair, and he also introduced direct election for the Mayor of London. All of those were major constitutional pieces for Mr. Blair.